Hey guys, and welcome to Diabetic 365, and today we are going to discuss bread. So is bread good for you? If it is, then how much quantity should be taken and what kind of bread should be taken? And today we have our diabetic educator Constance Brown. She is here with us to share why bread is good or bad and how much quantity it should be taken on which kind of bread. So Constance, tell us, before getting into is bread good or bad, what does bread actually contain? Like, what kind of bread is really good for diabetes?
Well, we always recommend whole grains when it comes to bread. And if you think in terms of the dietary guidelines, the recommendation is to make half of your grains whole grains. So at least about 3 ounces, which would be an average 3 slices of whole grain bread or whole wheat bread, would be a decent serving per day. And with bread, you're getting carbohydrate, of course. You're also getting B vitamins that come along with that. You're going to get fiber if it's a good whole grain bread. And I said B vitamins. Okay, so that's the primary things that you get from bread.
So here there are different kinds of bread when you walk the aisle in a supermarket. So there are different kinds, like white bread, there is this whole grain bread, there is rye bread, sprouted bread, sourdough bread. Usually many people think that whole grain is good, sourdough, rye, or sprouted bread. So of these 4 to 5 types, which one is best and better for our system, for a diabetic person?
Well, again, when you look at the bread, one of the crucial elements or ingredients to look at is whether or not it's made from whole wheat. That's number one. So you look at the ingredient list, and whole grain, whole wheat should be the first ingredient. That's going to let you know that that product has all of the fiber, all of the vitamins, minerals, and so on from the whole grain. That's number one. So if we think in terms of that, we know that white bread is refined, and it's not made from the whole grain. You're not going to see that on the list of ingredients. So white bread would be at the bottom of the list, basically.
Okay.
Then after that, it's really the whole grain and the individual's choice. Some people like rye bread. Rye bread is not necessarily in the category of whole grain, but it still can be taken in a balanced way in the diet and still enable individuals to have good control over their glucose levels. There are also things that you can do if you, for an example, just have to have that white bread that is refined by adding, if you add a little peanut butter, for an example, to that bread, you actually are going to help to decrease or slow down that release of the bread into the bloodstream. So it's going to control your blood sugar better by having that combination. So again, it's pretty much the same effect that we get from fiber. Fiber slows down the release of glucose into the bloodstream, and it prevents those spikes. So you can do that. But again, getting back to just the bread itself, the white bread would be at the bottom of the list. And then you have your whole wheat bread, your whole grain bread. The darker the bread in general, the better the bread is. So
the darker the bread is, the more the bread is, it's a whole grain. It represents more whole grain.
Really, so I'm sorry to cut across you.
So it's not that refined, and that barn is not taken away from that on the top of the grain. So that's the main ingredient, which contains more fiber, right?
And yes, and notice I did say generally, because I still want to direct everyone to look at the ingredient list. Sometimes what some manufacturers do to make their bread really look dark and of course make you just grab that particular loaf is they will add molasses to it. So that gives it a dark, rich color, but it doesn't have fiber. And that particular bread will actually have more carbohydrate because they've added molasses to it. So the key is, one, yes, you can look at it, you can do that visual check, but then you've got to double check and look at the ingredient list to make sure that it is whole grain.
Okay. So you shouldn't fall into this marketing tricks by this food marketing companies then.
True. Yes.
So what about this sourdough bread and also sprouted bread? These are two kinds of bread which many people talk about in the diabetes forums.
Sure. And when they're talking about those breads, you're really looking at breads and probably comparing the glycemic index. Mm-hmm. And your sourdough bread does tend to have a lower glycemic index than, for an example, white bread would have. Mm-hmm. The glycemic index is something that does have limitations. It's a useful tool if we look at it from the broad perspective. And the broad perspective is generally foods that have a low glycemic index are going to be those foods that are high in fiber. So again, your whole grain is going to have more fiber than the refined grain, and therefore give it more of a lower glycemic effect in the body. Mm-hmm. The downside of only looking at the glycemic index is, one, there's not a glycemic index for all foods, and the other thing is you're really not considering the available carbohydrate. So what may be more useful for your listeners, instead of looking at the glycemic index, is to really begin to look at the glycemic load, how much carbohydrate is really impacting one's glucose levels.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on bread, because many people have this kind of questions, and thank you so much. So to sum up, it's the whole grain, whole wheat bread that's good, which contains a lot of fiber and which stays in your system for a long time and releases your energy slowly, and you don't get that spikes. So to sum up, whole wheat bread is a good one.
Yes, and on the label it should say whole wheat or whole grain. That's what you look for.
Whole wheat or whole grain. In all the cases, the quantity is always the key. You have to maintain your quantity. So thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. So what about barley, this wild barley, which many people talk about? Is barley the kind of grain which which diabetics can take more frequently?
Well, again, when we talk about the grains, it's not the frequency so much as the quantity when you're eating it. Barley can be taken every single day, but it's the quantity. Again, looking at the carbohydrate. Barley also is a grain. It's a whole grain. That certainly is something that can be incorporated into a balanced diet.
Mm-hmm. And also there is two kinds of barley when you walk into Whole Foods or any supermarket. There is this pearl barley and also wild barley. I think pearl barley is more shiny and it's more processed, and wild barley is the one that is not that processed. It's kind of like when you compare to the whole wheat, it's like a whole wheat. So which one to choose in the aisle, pearl barley or wild barley?
Well, the wild is going to be the best, because just as you said, kind of reminds me when we had the discussion about the rice, the wild rice as compared to the white rice. So the wild barley is going to have more of that fiber. It's going to give you more of that control, more glycemic control as compared to the pearl barley.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your thoughts on bread and barley and the amount of barley or bread it should be taken. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Constance, and you have a nice day.
Thank you.